welcome to the American Vandal. For only the second time ever, live from Quarry Farm, the site of our origin and the means by which the Center for Mark Twain Studies was founded. I am very excited to be making a recording in person with a pair of scholars whom I have long admired, and also to be able to sort of share this conversation with some friends in the room and then with our listeners at home. My guests today are Caroline Levine from Cornell University. She is the Ryan Professor of the Humanities, and Jed Esty, who is the Vartan Gregorian Professor of English at University of Pennsylvania. And part of our occasion for talking is putting into conversation their most recent books, The ACTIVIST HUMANIST by Caroline Levine, Form and Method in the Climate Crisis, and The Future of Decline, Anglo-American Culture at Its Limits by Jed Esty. Both of these books have come out in the last 3 years. And some of you may remember that Jed was a guest on the Criticism Limited season that we did in late 2023. And I hope to recover some of the themes from that season, while also continuing the themes that have been part of A Tale of Today more recently. And in that spirit, I'm actually going to start with a question for Caroline that is based upon a moment from Criticism Limited which was particularly provocative for people. And I'm not going to try. I'm going to try not to refer to my notes too overly much today, but in this case, I thought it was important to get the words right. In that season, John Guillory said, "It's very hard to say what literary studies is doing for the climate crisis, what it is that criticism is doing for the climate crisis. If it's going to be solved, it's going to be solved at the level of politics, at the level of engineering, and we don't really have all that much to do with engineering." And I can report that although I regularly get emails about things that have been said on the podcast, I rarely get more than 5 about any single thing that is said on the podcast. But about those specific lines, I went back and counted this morning, about those specific lines, I got 76 emails. Many from people who wanted to respond or wished that I had responded in a more protracted way. And so one of the things I thought we would start with is, how would you respond? What struck me about reading your book is it begins essentially with a claim that is contrary to that, right? That many of the students that you have had in environmental humanities classes are from the sciences, are from engineering, are from exactly those disciplines that Guillory says are responsible for addressing climate crisis, and they're looking to the humanities for guidance. And so I thought it would be great to start there, right? How do you think about what the humanities has to offer to, and what literary or cultural criticism has to offer to the climate crisis?
I am so delighted to start there, because that is where my heart is. I will say, just to start off, that everybody, so I do a lot of talking about environmentalism to a lot of people, and everybody in every profession passes the buck. Everybody says that belongs to this other person, this other group, including people in the business world who could actually, stop investing in fossil fuels, and they say, oh, well, we need the government to restrict us because we can't do it. So anyway, in a world in which everybody's passing the buck, I wonder why not take it up ourselves. We at least have the tools to sit around and think about things. And so part of what I wanted to think about, and have always wanted to think about, is methods. What do literary studies scholars and other humanists have in terms of analytic tools that we can bring to the world? And so usually we think about literary studies in terms of its field of objects, but we do have a lot of practices and a lot of ways of thinking. And so if we think specifically in my the rabbit hole I go down most is the rabbit hole of formalism and thinking about literary shapes and structures, but then thinking, well, what about thinking shapes and structures everywhere, right? Who does that? Who steps back from all kinds of shapes and structures and makes sense of them? Well, sociologists do, and crystallographers do, and legal scholars do, but there isn't a discussion site for all of us in these different fields who think about these forms. And so thinking about what literary scholars can do to think about, for example, pipelines as a form. How do they work? How are they different from other forms? That seems to me like something we have a toolbox to work with. And so the questions I asked in my book were, what do we have to offer as humanists in this methodological toolbox? And then also, if we stop passing the buck and we think, okay, it's our job as much as anybody else's to try to act, what are the forms of action that work? And what kinds of political action can and should we take? So I ended up in a place that was disciplinarily incredibly strange. It was, political theory meets engineering meets literary studies.
I'm going to follow up, before I turn to Jed, I want to kind of follow up with that urge to action. And I think urgency is something that I want to sort of talk to both of you about. I am sure that many people, when they see the title of your book, fixate on the notion of activism as potentially fraught in our current political moment, and the kind of idea of activist scholarship or activist humanism has been treated as sort of part of the problem of an overly leftist academy, right? And so I wanted to follow up with that notion of what is the kind of active role that you are seeking from humanists in our contributions to thinking about forms like, as you said, pipelines and enclosures and pathways, right? That a lot of the forms that you address in this book are not, novels and poems and plays, right? But you're thinking about them with some of the same tools. And so how does it move from theory to practice, from theory to activism?
Great question. I think part of what drew my attention was the fact that so much of across the humanities fields has been resistant to any action taking, right? And so we have theories of power, we have an analyses of power, we have theories of politics. Some people think we're too political, some people think we're not political enough, but we have those debates all the time. Well, we don't really ever, in my own experience, being educated or being an educator, talk about the nuts and bolts of politics. Like, how do you do it? How do you get power? How do you organize for power? What works? What doesn't work? And I realized I was so hungry for answers to those questions that I started reading across fields for answers to the questions about what works. And it turns out that doesn't really belong anywhere either disciplinarily. There are historians who focus on particular movements that have worked, and political theorists, but not that many of them who think about what works. And so this seemed to me like a very strange fact, that we're thinking a lot about politics, but we're not thinking a lot about which actions actually have the consequences of helping us to build the world that we want to build. And so part of the question I asked in the book is, why are humanists so opposed to action? What is it about our fields that prompt us to refuse to take action and to think that activist and humanist are actually contradictory terms. And I came to the conclusion that we have a kind of investment in rupture, in breaking, in resistance, but not in building. And so it's not true across the board, but it is true across different subfields in the humanities, like, among the real aesthetics for its own sake crowd, and then also among the critical Black studies crowd, right? There's often an interest in remaking the academy, but not in thinking about how our analyses of power and our analysis of how things work could actually be brought to bear on action. And so I suddenly found myself in a place I really never expected to be, and sometimes feel like, and have been told that I'm selling out the humanities because I'm imagining practical action as something we could take part in, and that's just, really
dangerous.
Dangerous, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's actually, I'm going to segue to Jed, both because I want to get him involved in the conversation, but also because I think there is a natural way to think about how your book is taking on, from a very different structural perspective, this question of what can we do and how can humanities scholars contribute to the solving of a major political or political economic problem, right? That the way I think about the future of decline is as a book that presents us with a problem as you define it, that America is in decline, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we lean into the negative context of that decline, we will make it worse. And so what can we do to prevent the kind of myths and fears and paranoias associated from decline, associated with kind of imperial decline or national decline, from leading to worse outcomes, not just for Americans, but for the rest of the world. And you look to a British example for what are the problems that happened at the end of the British Empire that we can maybe try to avoid or learn from. And so there is a kind of urgency and also a kind of activism that I see in your book as well. We talked about it at some length during Criticism Limited a couple of years ago, but I would argue that the sense and the potency of declinism has become amplified in the ensuing years. And in particular, I think about what you describe as superpower nostalgia being of a whole nother level during the 2024 election and in the early months of this new administration. And so I'm going to ask us sort of two questions, right? What are the major lessons that we need to take away from declinism in the British context? And what has changed about superpower nostalgia since you finished writing this book?
Well, I mean, it is so obviously galloping forward into even deeper and darker places than it was even in 2022, now that we have a full-blown Trump 2.0 tariff protectionist wedded to bizarrely techno-futurist versions of Escape from the Planet, with Elon Musk ignoring climate by saying we're all going to be in Mars or in interplanetary colonies someday in the future. But I think the signal contradiction that I was trying to track that cuts across the British example roughly 70 years earlier, the American kind of present moment, is this core contradiction that people who wield declinism as a political weapon tend to wield it in a contradictory fashion by telling Americans, you are in a terrible edge-of-the-cliff moment in history, and you're fine, and you will always be the best country in the world. And it's that paralyzing, contradictory message that I think what can we do? We can reveal the contradiction, and we can counter-program and counter-educate the contradiction. And I guess it's such an important, to me, it's such an important contradiction in how our students, for example, and our fellow citizens experience the effects of that contradiction. One is through an endless cycle of austerity. Essentially, I think that the decline discourse of America in the last 50 years is completely welded to the economicization of everything. So that all of us now feel that the economy is our responsibility and that we are in some ways constantly failing that responsibility, and everything is metricized. This is a point that's threaded its way through a couple of recent seasons of American Vandal. So on the one hand, one pole of the contradiction is America's at the edge and it's our job to somehow restore greatness. Obviously that's a very resonant message for the American right. And the other side is supremacy, which is America is at the center and always will be. And that paralyzing contradiction is one that puts, I think, American political discourse in a constant spin cycle of impossible and effectively anti-political discourse, because on the culture side, the identity and belonging discourses, especially the white minoritarian MAGA discourses, are basically saying, speaking to the belonging and identity and myth crowd, a kind of supremacy, which was very much patent in the British imperial phase in the cultural bloodlines and media systems of 19th and 20th century Britain. And on the other hand, producing this constant anxiety and urgency to kind of put America back in the center. So, but the short answer is Stuart Hall's answer, which is why I organized the book around British cultural studies, which may be a contact point between your work and mine, Caroline. Which is, I take my inspiration from Stuart Hall saying, British people were trained to believe in their supremacy and in their empire at a distinct point in history, and it was an interlocking media, popular culture, and elite establishment, educational, ideological mission. It was done, and it could be undone. And I think, the most optimistic thing I have to say to people about the framing of that book that you're asking me about is, I think the same is true about American supremacy and American declinism. There are interests that are advanced by people being in that spin cycle, and we as educators and people you've talked to this season who are journalists and other members of the media world can unite in trying to reveal the nonsense of that way of thinking.
Yeah. You identify in the book that there are several professional classes who contribute disproportionately to creating the myth of declinism, but also potentially, as you said, it was through Stuart Hall, undoing or debunking that myth. And I'm going to concentrate on our little corner of that professional strata that is educators, and sort of follow up by one of the things that came out of reading the book for me personally was a return to historicism as both a scholarly methodology, but even more so as a pedagogical practice, right? I started thinking of myself as a teacher of history in the classroom, even if I was teaching media studies, whether I was teaching literature classes or American studies classes or cultural studies classes or media studies classes, I was always thinking of myself first as a teacher of history. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to follow up by asking, and that has been a hard thing to be in the last couple of years. And I want to follow up by asking, what have we gotten wrong about history and historicism in the kind of post-new historicist era of literary studies?
A lot. I think that we who are in literary and cultural humanities have a special access to history because we do not practice historiography proper, which is, a study of more or less positively verifiable or falsifiable historical analysis and historical interpretation. We're doing a history of myth, identity, belonging. We're doing a history of mechanisms and forms by which people make sense of the world. And by doing that, we have the possibility of working out positive and negative dialectic at once in the classroom. And it's much more simple than it seems. Really what I think we're talking about, starting with this podcast itself, what you do in the form of this podcast is an investigation that's very elongated and interlocking of what I would call actors and causes. So that rather than understanding historicism as a kind of new historicist slice, where we see a set of effects and a set of phenomenologically processed events, you know, the swirl of being alive, which I think so many of our students and we ourselves feel, that is part of the Trump media strategy, by the way, is to produce a chaotic swirl so that actors and causes can't be traced. And careful historicism, which is not the same as good historiography, but careful historicism is tracking actors and causes in an empirical and even positivistic way, while also tracking a history of false narratives that accompany the mystification of those actors and causes. And that's our special and secret weapon that needs not to be secret. People who study the media system and who study the history of forms and the history of storytelling and myth-making can unite with historiographical empiricism to produce, for students, I think, a whole story about not only what are the actors and causes, but why haven't we been able to recognize that? And that's why, you know, the work that you do on the podcast is kind of like long-form investigative journalism, is kind of like, in many people's classrooms, a slow process of thinking, not what does it all look like and how does it all feel, but where did it come from? And that, the most important and most transformative thing we can believe in as humanists in a terrible moment of crisis is that we can teach students to think it didn't have to be this way, and it won't always be this way.
Yeah.
It's contingency, in other words.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect word to segue from, because I was going to ask a similar question of Caroline, which is formalism, like historicism, has sometimes gotten a bad name, even in literary studies, and this is something that you identify and trace in your book. And so what have we gotten wrong about formalism, and is there some intersection in the way that the rejections of formalism and the rejections of historicism have overlapped with one another?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if you don't mind, in the spirit of dialogue,
Yeah.
I will actually say I think that historicism has had a major shortcoming also, and part of what I've been trying to do is to argue for formalism, not as ahistorical, but against some versions of historicism. And I think, and please, I want you both to respond to this, but I think that when we teach, often in the classroom, when we teach students a kind of historical context for certain ideas, even myths, contradictions, we do not make it seem like things could have happened otherwise. We make it seem like this is the way it happened. And for them, it was in the classroom that I started to ask students, what's the relationship between, I'm a 19th century British literature person originally, what's the relationship between what we're reading here and your lives? And they were not making the connection. They were thinking of it as this discrete moment, separate from ours. And so part of what formalism does, from my point of view, is it activates some of those things that are both inherited, right, that we've gotten from the past, and allows us to see the kind of what's going on right now in our historical moment that we could work with and make something from based on historical examples, but not necessarily just, because there's such an emphasis in historical thinking on specificity and things belonging to a moment only.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's right. That is the sort of mortal sin of new historicism, is getting into that microscope slide version of history. And I think our discipline became so allergic in those days, and I think you were maybe trained at exactly that moment, to patterns and universals and forms, which don't need to bespeak some kind of conservative framing of human nature or universalism as against difference and specificity, as long as you both do form and history together. And that proved hard to do, and the discipline fell into somewhat stupid methodological divisions as you either do context or some kind of high formalist text, when almost everyone, practically speaking, in the classroom and in their research is trying to do both and trying to find the magic connection point between them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly where the conversation goes into the sort of where history and form meet. And that's why I was trying to start by saying historiography is a different kind of thing. It has its own forms, of course. But I think our discipline got sort of anti-anthropological and hyper-Foucauldian specific historicist at a time that where that might have been a useful protocol, but we really need a different protocol now.
So this conversation has reminded me of another scholar who I interviewed for this season and whose work I've been thinking with a lot recently, which is Jordan Carroll, whose book on speculative whiteness and science fiction in the alt-right actually makes a kind of argument about speculation and speculative fiction like the one that we're talking about with history, which is there is one group of readers, or a group that he identifies with the alt-right, who see speculative fiction as prophetic, as a future to be realized, as a kind of inevitability, in the same way that we sometimes teach and look back at history as a series of effects, right? As a sort of inevitable set of occurrences, instead of a set of contingencies, right? And then there's another group, hopefully a more populist group, who looks to speculative fiction as a way of thinking exactly about potential and contingency, right? And this is the kind of Jamesonian obsession with science fiction and speculative fiction, right? Is that through it we can see the kind of tendrils of history going in all directions and the possibilities of utopia and dystopia that lie side by side with one another. And this is something that I see in, I'm not sure he himself would describe it this way, but this is something I see in Yanis Varoufakis' work on both techno-feudalism and his own appropriations of speculative fiction, is that sort of use of this increasingly popular mode and genre in the contemporary that has unfortunately also been politicized and is being used in the same way kind of mythic history gets used. And so I guess where I would move from that is like, what are the genres that you are looking to find that potential, that contingency in this moment of urgency?
I think there's a kind of a few of us right at the moment who are really thinking hard with and about realism, as opposed to speculative fiction. And for me, it's a very, I think, flat-footed version of literature, which I'm going to try to honor and stand with firmly here, which is, what are the materials we have to work with right now? And so a lot of speculative fiction actually depends on a radical break with what is, to a future which can't be realized now because we don't have the technology, or we don't, the aliens haven't come yet. Maybe that'll save us. But so far, that's not what's happening. So what can we know about the world that we have, and what tools do we have and forms do we have to work with in the present? And so Kim Stanley Robinson is, for me, the beautiful marriage of the two. But he's kind of alone. Like, there aren't other writers doing Robinsonian kinds of fiction. And so much
speculative realism,
yeah, speculative realism,
which is perfect because he was a student of Frederick Jameson, who invoked the question. Yeah. I mean, if you're asking about fictional genres or genres of more or less literary production in the present, I don't know. I do think Caroline's on the right track in terms of thinking about realism in the way that I think Anna Kornblue has in her Immediacy book, and you've circled around those ideas in this season, last couple seasons too. Yeah. In part because, once you start seeing the alt-right version of speculative fiction wedded to the ideology of techno-futurism, and there's a very important gender strand to that too. There's a kind of masculinist reappropriation of speculative fiction from its positioning, since the 70s as not just white male science geeks dreaming about robots and space, but it's kind of it's, as with everything else that's being piled into white revanche and masculinist backlash, there's a kind of pulling of that speculative fiction. And one thing that Anna Kornblue says in Immediacy that I think is really powerful about realism is that is the literature of social institutions. And we've had this crazy political and ideological flip now where the progressive left and center left both have to defend institutions, even the center right, against right-wing disruptive institutional junking and trashing and dismantling that we're seeing in front of our eyes in this moment. That puts a spin on the relationship between speculative fiction and realist fiction. But I think there are two other things I would say about genre in the present. One is that while we're sitting in Mark Twain's Quarry farm, satire and speculative fiction are the two, for Frederick Jameson, the two great sites of social negation or social criticism. And there have been a lot of successful satires and satirical fictions, among recent writers of all kinds in American literature and British literature. And that's an important genre. I don't actually like teaching it. And I wonder about that because I like teaching, I like pulling those threads out through a realist text better than a satirical one. But the other way to divide up the pie, if we're talking about the present, is sort of the autofiction / historical novel divide. And when I read a lot of contemporary literature scholars, I feel like they sort themselves into the novel is still about the bourgeois individual, autofictionally sort of hyper-Proustian, or the novel of the present, as in Xander Mansfield, who I think was also in this season, is the prestige novel for writers of color and others, is the historical novel.
And I'll just point out, they sort themselves, or the publishing, I think Xander and Dan might say, or the publishing industry has sorted them, giving them those two options. Yeah. And maybe only those two options for many writers. Yeah.
Yes, and that's kind of like a torn dialectic in the same way that historicism and formalism are at the level of our method, at the level of our objects. It's like centered bourgeois psychological fiction or historical fiction, likewise speculative fiction or realist fiction. But almost everything that we study and canonize and revere and that our students are interested in is mélange of these genres. And the reason we're rightly skeptical through the Jordan Carroll prism of your question about alt-right appropriations of speculative fiction is that once was a society-busting look at the past and the present rather than a institution-busting fantasy about the future that will allow us to avoid the social contradictions of race, environment, and justice in the present by imagining that somehow in another planet or in another future they will be resolved. And that's American innocence at its worst.
Yeah. No, I love that, thinking about the origins of science fiction in Twain, in Wells, right, in the late 19th and early 20th century, as having a project that is almost antithetical to the project of speculative fiction as Jordan sees it in the right wing.
Well, that's a Gilded Age that you maybe haven't touched on.
Gilded
Age point about the present and that 1890s moment.
Yeah. So I have two questions that are sort of, I think, structurally similar, although thematically quite different for the two of you. The first, I'll ask Caroline first again. In your book, you do a tactic, I would say, over and over again, which is you take terminologies or forms that have been loaded with negative connotations in literary studies, cultural studies discourse, and particularly in Marxist or socialist politics. And you try to turn them sort of on their head. And I'm going to ask about one of those in particular because it has also been a theme in this season of American Vandal, which is enclosure. Right? And so, for the people who I've talked to in this season, from the very start with Astor Taylor, she uses enclosure as a way of defining how insecurity is exacted upon populations. And she goes back to, Robin Hood and the enclosure of the commons, but also sees that as the project of neoliberalism and Reagan republicanism, and so on and so forth. And then later on with Leclerc Leberg and Yanis Varoufakis, they look to enclosure as one of the things that is mobilizing and monetizing things like AI and the techno-feudal cloudalists. Right? And so I was hoping you could describe what is it about you make this sort of wonderful you draw this wonderful tension from how we celebrate shelter while derogating enclosure. Mm-hmm. And so I was hoping you could walk us through what enclosure might have to offer when we so often think of it as something that is capturing us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think in literary studies and maybe more broadly in the humanities, we have had a tendency to take a form and attach it to a particular politics, and then to think that that politics always follows from that form. And enclosure is a good example from my point of view. Definitely the enclosure movement is a crucial mechanism for the dispossession of the land and the creation of the proletariat and exploitation. So no question that there is a moment in which enclosure is only bad. Similarly, national enclosures, you could say, are violent forms, heavily policed forms. But this misses, to my mind, the affordances, the good affordances, the positive affordances of enclosures. And so if we look at this room that we're sitting in right now, beautiful library in the Mark Twain house at Quarry Farm, we're glad that the window is not open right now, because the wind and the rain would come in, the bugs would come in, we wouldn't be able to hear each other, right? Like even the simple fact of enclosing a room is affords the possibility of conversation, of sociality, right? And so thinking about shelter, and I've learned a ton from Susan Freeman, whose book Extreme Domesticity is one of my favorites. She says desiring shelter is not necessarily conservative, and it was a sentence that really sent off lots and lots of excitement for me, because as a scholar of the domestic novel, the 19th century novel, the idea that domesticity is always imprisoning, is always the private sphere as opposed to the public sphere, is always misses the fact that actually, as far as I can tell, all human societies have always produced shelter. Spaces for rest and gathering. And so what are we doing if we decide that enclosure is always bad? Are we really imagining living without walls altogether? What would that look like? And so one of the things I tried to think about is public housing, because, or social housing as it's maybe more appropriately called now. So we have this kind of narrative in the US about how social housing projects were terrible and needed to be torn down and all that kind of stuff. But research suggests that social housing is great, and it works really well, and it works a lot better than not social housing. And so what are enclosures that could be built that have affordances that we might think of as really desirable, like the building of egalitarian communities? And so I looked at a bunch of examples, and one of my favorites was in Germany, where there's a kind of old army barracks that along a river, and the city made it possible for groups of people to apply to remake these buildings as social housing, but they had certain qualifications. They had to meet certain specifications, and one was they had to be green buildings. But my favorite one was a kind of, if Foucault was looking at it, he'd call it a panopticon, but it had a kind of courtyard area, and then two enclosures, one for small children and one for elderly people with dementia. And that is a way for everybody to be safe, for people to let their children and their elderly relatives be freer than they would be otherwise. So to my mind, building creative enclosures for living is a better idea than saying enclosure is always bad.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up, because there's a word that you used several times there, that you used in several of your books, that I think is important for us to sort of define, in part because as I see it, it's sort of crucial to a project that I see both you and Anna Corbleu undertaking, which is trying to sort of rectify the divide between structuralism and post-structuralism. And that word is affordances. So what is the way that you theorize affordance?
So I borrowed it from design theory, and I found it, it was like one of those lightning bolts to my own thinking, because I'd been frustrated with the idea that forms can do multiple things, and yet we kept, and as a person who wants to think about literature and politics, we kept attaching certain forms to certain politics, and this seemed wrong to me. So reading design theory about how any given design, you know, it lives up to its purpose if it allows you to do the thing that it's designed to allow you to do, but lots of designs are actually intended to have a lot of different possibilities. So a table could be a place where you eat and socialize. It could be a place where you write a dissertation, right? Like, it's got lots of affordances. There are other things it can't do at all. So those are the limits to its possibility. And so for me, one of the helpful things for thinking about literature and politics was, instead of having, let me see if I can say this efficiently, instead of thinking, you know, I'm interested in climate change in the novel, so I'm going to think about all the ways in which the novel can help us think climate change, I think, what are the things the novel is good at helping us to think? And what can't it do? What is it not good at? And so one of the things the novel I think is really bad at is crowds and masses. Like, it's really not good at that. And it's great novels experiment with that, and it's not that it can't, but it's really pushing at the limits of those affordances. So I feel better about the analysis of both the politics of literature and the possibility of all the forms that surround us if we think about the full range of their what they can do and what they can't do, and live with those limits. So I think part of what's useful there is also to think about unintended affordances. So the famous example from design theory is a doorknob. So doorknob's a great design for getting in and out of doors, but you can also hang something on a doorknob, right? And so people expand the affordances of the doorknob. So there's room for creativity in affordances also. There's just not room for infinite creativity. And that feels to me like a materialist, or to me, a very important materialist argument, which is to say, there are limits to what human bodies can do, to what buildings can do, to what, you know, and we live in those limits. So let's think about how we could use those limits and not only think of them as constraints, but also as every artist knows, constraints are also help you to make new things, right? So let's think about how we can make a world with the forms and the materials that we have.
Excellent, yeah. So for Jed, this kind of question of how do we turn a existing cliche or assumption in literary theory into its potential opposite, I'm going to make more about an event, which is 2008. You begin your book with this wonderful reading of the Summer Olympic opening ceremonies in 2008, and how there is both this kind of cultural projection of the coming Chinese century that is happening simultaneous with the unraveling of the global economy, led by the American subprime mortgage crisis, but involving all of the countries gathered there at the Games, including, very importantly, China. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask, 2008 has been, I think, the kind of ghost in the machine of our politics ever since. And usually it is treated as a moment of obscenity, vulgarity, horror, right? And I'm wondering if we can see 2008 through other lenses at this point in time, particularly through as we sort of reckon with supertest power nostalgia up against kind of rising empire exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm. Never let a good financial emergency go to waste.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that each of these forked path moments have a dangerous alternative possibility, which is that it's a doubling down of all the most retrograde forces in our society, and the financial rescue and rebuild that Obama, presided over successfully from the point of view of most middle class Americans, reconstructed the same dysfunctional, heavily leveraged, hyper-financialized economic system that was responsible for the thing breaking in the first place without meaningful reform. It was exactly not what Adorno would have called working through the past. Mm-hmm. It was just, let's put it all back together and hope that another crisis doesn't happen, and they always do, and they always will. I think it's hard to imagine how to talk about this question you're asking me about 2008 without thinking about the whole framework that we're working in today of Gilded Ages, mm-hmm. and what they mean and how they end and how they crash. Mm-hmm. And there's so many powerful temporal frames that you're presenting to us and to your audience, and one of them is that there was a kind of massive buildup of surplus capital in late 19th century America that produced various phenomena that we associate with something like the Gilded Age, that Twain is a sort and partner. Who's his co-author?
Charles Dudley Warner.
Yes, I don't know how I forgot that, because I've heard you say his name 10 times. At that moment. And then there's a progressive era that is about some kind of both moral and political state-driven restraint on galloping capitalism. And then there's a 20s in which capitalism is galloping again, and then there's a crash. And we have a temporality frame here, which is a Gilded Age then and a Gilded Age now, but we also have the endless recycled temporality of boom and bust in the economic cycle, and crash and recovery, and Gilded Ages followed by an endless return to a kind of austere, I would say, broadly liberal to neoliberal politics and economics, and ultimately aesthetics of austerity, in which people's understanding of what it means to live psychologically and politically and phenomenologically in capitalism is to go without. And unfortunately, the crisis of 2008, I don't think motivated that many people to imagine that that was the moment. And in the book that you're asking me about, and the way I'm using 2008, I am actually trying to produce a possibility for progressives and center-left sort of liberals of the mainstream Democratic Party to harmonize on the point that the way to win back something like a functional left-center critique of capitalism in order to pave the way down the road for a more social democratic and socialist critique of capitalism would be to say, it's okay if America and China are either cooperative co-superpowers, or even if Asian capitalism is the site of dynamism now. A lot of progress was actually made in British society after the site of capitalist dynamism moved across the Atlantic. A lot of liberalization with regard to race, sexuality, the social welfare state. There's so many ways in which in America that stops clinging tightly with every talent in its eagle body to supremacy, global supremacy, could reorganize itself around a great society kind of rhetoric and stop this endless dismantling of the welfare state, the thing that occurred between the two Gilded Ages, the great Keynesian middle, in which a functional belief in capitalism as progress for people and not progress for plutocrats could be imagined as something Americans at least can think about. Yeah. That's the antithesis of techno-feudalism to me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, this will be my last question because I want to make sure we leave time for others, but I want to ask you, under the auspices, under the thesis or hypothesis that times of crisis and periods of threat are also exactly the moments where opportunities to build present themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What do the humanities, literary studies, academia writ large, you choose the constituency, what should we be building in this moment of imminent threat?
Oh boy.
I'll give one answer that's kind of a funky one, and only will make immediate sense to people who've been loyal fans, as I am, of American Vandal and following you through another wrinkle in the conversation, another time wrinkle that's much larger than 1890s Gilded Age and 2025 Gilded Age, and that is print capitalism, a long arc from Gutenberg and Martin Luther all the way to the present. And Varoufakis, who you interviewed a couple different times, or across a couple different episodes at least, was participating in that conversation. And you got yourself, I think, intrigued by the notion of an almost neo-medieval understanding of a post-capitalist, post-print world. And one part of that argument, the materialist part of that argument, coming from Varoufakis, is the runaway capitalism of the techno-lords of the present is not pro-capitalist, it's destroying markets. It's neo-guild, neo-mercantilist economy. I don't think he uses those words, but that's effectively what he's arguing. And then there's what is the work of the cultural and media and educational establishments that we all work in and that we are interested in, and amongst the sort of death of print journalism and the pressure under which higher ed now functions, what is there? And one thing that came up, this is the funky wrinkle to which I referred, is the return of a kind of oral culture, of which podcasting is a great instance. And what can we do? What are we doing? I mean, one of the things that's really important for me in a university setting is speaking to students, speaking with students, listening to students, and trying to imagine the next generation of people in trying to lead them through this sort of historicist analysis that we were talking about earlier in this discussion. The pressure that AI and ed tech are putting on our usual print capitalist mode of exchange with students, which is I assign you reading and writing, you go to some private cubicle and try to work your way through it while also looking at your phone every 20 seconds, is being displaced and replaced by a post-AI mode of educational communication that I think is actually very promising. And it's a huge disruption of how we do business, which is hyper efficient for reasons that you have diagnosed yourself, Matt, in terms of squeezing every dollar out of the educational labor force that can be squeezed. But if we re-insist on face-to-face work with our students, reading together, writing together, talking together, I see a different future for the college and university, all types. And this is rather utopian of me to say this in the context of the very powerful techno-feudalist framework, the horror show of this season of American Vandal. But I take the spirit of the question to be a spirit of a dialectical flip, which is out of crisis very often do come new accommodations around labor and communication. And we should think about that as our work.
Yeah, before I let Caroline answer as well, I think you have diagnosed something that I don't think I have actually said outright on the podcast, but that I have been struggling with is, you are absolutely right. I have been flirting with this neo-medievalist thesis coming out of Jeff Jarvis in particular, and the question that is raised, I think this is a question that is explicitly raised by Jim Livingston when I presented it to him, is oral culture, is the Socratic method in the classroom, and take it another step, are podcasts inevitably conservative, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly there are traditions that would suggest as much, and can we sort of have the kind of Jamesonian use of an institution like podcasting or medium like podcasting for that purpose of political inversion is a question that remains sort of up in the air to me. I find myself, on the one hand, obviously loving working in this medium. On the other hand, learning more and more about its history, its present, and also its ties to radio, right, which McLuhan famously credits for the rise of the Third Reich, and wondering, and not to mention the American history of radio, and with religious conservatism and Rush Limbaugh, culture wars. Like, does this media lend itself to a politics other than the one that has monopolized it so far?
Yeah. Do you mind if I just tangle with that
Please.
for a minute before you jump in with your version of saving the world? Yeah, I mean, I heard you and Jim Livingston having that exchange about the dangers of oral culture, and I believe he was citing Wendy Brown as having given voice to the other side of the argument, which is this is a good thing. And I do think print mediation is really significantly important. I think that's another thing I agree with Anna Kornblue about. And I do think I wanted to step in for two reasons. One, to say something about the novel in the spirit that you were talking about, which is, there was a moment with novels where the affordance or the special thing that novels could do was to unite and harmonize intimate, sensory, emotional, sexual, private, individualized, prismatic understandings of events and social forces and social processes wedded to each other. And if we could have imagined back then in the 1820s or the 1910s a technology, digital as it will have turned out, in which we could learn about other people's lives but without any attachment to those social processes, it would look like social media. I mean, 10 million chances to see how people cook and eat and unfortunately, put on deodorant, and that is like the horror show ending of the novel's long history as a human technology medium, which is the stripping away of that special relationship between social process and individual experience. And that's what Varoufakis was talking about when he talked about captured experience. This is what the algorithm and the social mediatization of our existence is doing, which is colonizing or enclosing, in a negative sense, more and more of private experience so that there's less and less to have. And that's one thing about why presence in oral culture could be seen as a counter medium. And there was a second point I wanted to make about that, but you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, I can't help but think, based upon that answer, R.I.P. Josh Clover, right? That is in some ways the argument that he's made about how the novel transforms in the 20th and 21st century.
And that is why the whole autofiction versus historical novel separation is, I think, an unfortunate symptom of what is maybe like a kind of publishing industry in extremis, trying to figure out ways to hold on to market niches that barely exist. But I also think that another part of what you've been saying about radio and oral media and their fascistic dangers points out something that I think the season of American Vandal hasn't yet landed on fully, or I might have missed it, but which is the two Gilded Ages is one interesting parenthesis, the long Gutenberg parenthesis, another interesting one. But really the moment of the 1930s kind of keeps coming back, and it is really less about the big shift, which is effectively a leapfrog shift from print culture to digital culture, because in between in the 1930s is maybe the focal point or the inflection point of the shift from print culture to image culture / radio and cinema, and that second
modernist media.
Modernist media, exactly. And that was a moment where the world was once again divided between what looked like a techno-feudalist, fascist, Albert Speer kind of version of the turning of media technologies and technology period and techno-futurism in the Italian futurist sense, towards a kind of hideous political future. But at the same time, there was an incredible entrenched, even in the heavily industrialized West, like in Roosevelt's America, entrenched neo-pioneer, neo-folk, agrarian sensibility, which was its soft fascistic or conservative other, and only with the intervention of heavily institutionalized liberal state formations, which were unfortunately attached to racism and American hegemony, but were the thing that we probably need to go back to now. And this is why I think the left and the liberal center need to get their coalitional politics framed properly, which is not in the spirit of Josh Clover, by the way.
No.
It is in the spirit of my argumentation about how we once had billionaires who were part of the modern bourgeois revolution. Now we have billionaires who are themselves medievalists, who want nothing to do with building a functional society or nation or government. And that's who we have to fight.
Okay, now I have to respond to both of these.
Yeah.
The first to say, I think, Matt, your question about whether oral media is necessarily conservative is exactly the thing I was trying to say. I don't think anything is necessary. I don't think there's any form that is necessarily one thing or the other. It's how we put it to use in what context, and so I would hope not. And I think there's tremendous potential for podcasting as a educational, discursive, debate-filled medium. So I am going to push back on that one. But I think what we need to do, what I would like us to do, is to think, is to put our minds collectively to the question that came up at the beginning of our conversation, which is things could be otherwise, right? Most people I talk to, academics especially, leftists all over the place, really don't think about how to take power. They feel like these forces are juggernauts that are bigger than we are. Of course they are, but how could they be otherwise? How can we think about how to build power? And to my mind, so far, from what I can tell, it requires building large movements. And we have not traditionally in academia been at all even remotely focused on that. But coalition building is the place to do that, and dropping a kind of purity politics is the way to do that. That is to say, temporary but powerful coalitions that are large enough to move major political movements, to develop political movements. That's where I think we need to be thinking. And the humanities are really, really bad at that. We're really good at the individual efflorescence of the creative mind, right? The scientists and the social scientists are good at big populations. We're good at the individual text and the individual writer. I think we shouldn't be anymore, because I think we're building ourselves our own powerless. We're disempowering ourselves. So how can we re-empower ourselves? And I think it's through thinking this question of how to make things otherwise, and also how to make collectives, and what are the forms by which collectives actually take shape.
That's excellent. Thank you both so much. We have a small